Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Vertical Stars Podcast fourth season. My loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. It's an amazing episode because the JewCe team boards a mothership to discuss the Jewish comic experience, film, and exhibit. Now, come on board with me with Traversing the Stars. Hello, all. Thank you for coming to Vertical Stars Podcast, Roy, Dan, Dr. Miriam, and Tony. How's it going, everyone?
Great.
Swell.
Terrific.
That's, that's
Oh, I'm sorry. I
fantastic.
didn't see you there. I was just reading this fantastic book. I just can't put it down. It's amazing. Sorry, I'm with you now. Hi.
No, I appreciate that. That was a very subtle plug. We appreciate that.
I do sound well, yeah.
So you guys are all involved with the film for the Jewish comic experience. So what inspired the creation of the documentary?
Tony.
Roy, why don't you start? I'll answer creative questions.
Um,
And Roy will answer questions creatively.
um, Dr. Mora, Miriam, together with Fabrice Sapolsky, put together, and then with Danny Fingeroth, an amazing exhibit and event at the Center for Jewish History, which is a Smithsonian affiliate in New York, called the Jewish Comics Experience, which was at a scale that's never been done before, really looking at the Jewish roots of the comic book industry, the superhero genre, the comic book medium. These are Jewish creations. The same way that jazz is an African American creation and can be traced to a very specific time in history, right? Early 20th century, Harlem Renaissance in Harlem and in New Orleans. Comic books have a very specific history that's really not been explored. People who are invested in comics to the point where they watch this fantastic show may know more than the average person, but the average person has no idea that comic books are a Jewish invention. Superheroes are a Jewish invention. The whole industry, for most of its lifespan, was predominantly Jewish. So that's what that exhibit explored from that perspective. We were lucky enough; it was well received. It's traveling internationally right now. It's in DC. It's going to be traveling for the next decade or so. Um, and the event went well. And one thing led to another, and JLTV, Jewish Live Television, which is a cable network, approached the center and asked if we would help produce a documentary about this topic. At this point, I was loitering in front of the center. They called me in, see if I had any ideas, and I had one. I knew genuinely a genius director, and I know these terms are thrown around. Brilliant, genius, everybody's, but a truly gifted artist with a vision, and that would be Tony. And I asked for his 2 cents on it, and he just grabbed that idea and ran with it and created an amazing documentary. And saying this as a fan, first and foremost, who's seen every comic book documentary on Netflix and Amazon, this is one of the best I've ever seen. And given that wasn't created with a studio budget, makes it all the more amazing.
So I know this is a loaded question or not, but why is now the time for this documentary and the exhibit to exist?
Well, I would answer that, I suppose, with um, this could have existed a long time ago if the opportunity had presented itself and, interested parties and funders had shown up. So I don't think it's necessarily only possible now. Um, but I do think it's one of the reasons that our first year of the event, and this is the Jewish Comics Experience Convention, which was last year in November 2023. One of the reasons that it was so important in that moment was that even before October 7th, there had been this rise in anti-Semitism, which is always paired with a rise in discussion about anti-Semitism, which really kind of narrows the focus of all of the conversations that we're having about the Jewish place in the world and the Jewish voice in the world. And one of the things that we set out to do with JewCe was to celebrate Jewish joy and Jewish contributions and Jewish narratives. Um, and I think that the fact that October 7th happened a month before the convention gave us an, totally unforeseen opportunity to demonstrate just how important this focus on Jewish joy and Jewish contribution for its own sake really was. because it was an amazing coming together of people and ideas, and the interest in the exhibit was tremendous, and people went. There was a specific instance. I remember I was working at the center as the academic director at the time, and a group of Holocaust survivors came into the exhibit, and they walked through the historical exhibit part, which talks about a lot of the same things that are in the documentary. And then they went to the costuming area and just played for, a half hour, putting on costumes, jumping in the photo booths, having truly a great time. And I think that was, I don't know, a celebration of Jewish joy in a really tough moment. And that's exactly what we set out to do. And the exhibit was a success, and is continuing to travel as a success. And the convention just had its second run yesterday and was a tremendous success, I think. And then this documentary is just carrying it further into greater audiences, which is spreading the joy even more.
So I just wanted to note that there have been exhibitions um, dealing with the Jewish aspect of comics origins and comics characters. I'm thinking specifically of an exhibit that Jerry Robinson, who was the creator or co-creator of the Joker, put together that traveled a couple of in the 2000s. So people have done it piecemeal. There certainly have been attempts. There were kind of proto-Jewish Comic-Cons in a small synagogue in Brooklyn that Fabrice Sapolsky and Fred Polanecki and they brought me in. And so, but this Juice convention and the exhibition, which really is comprised of multiple mini exhibitions, you might call them, is, I think, the most wide-ranging, the most diverse, the most ambitious attempt to curate a Jewish Comic-Con, Jewish exhibition, and the documentary, I think, is a very good encapsulation of the content and the spirit, not to be confused with the Will Eisner character, of the Jewish comics experience that is 5,000 years in the making.
So when you're conceptualizing the making of the documentary and the exhibit, were you envisioning as a way for Jews to celebrate our culture and our history? Was it more for those who aren't Jewish to try to learn about the Jewish history and culture, especially within comic books? What was the main impetus of the conceptualization of the documentary?
Yes. Here's the thing. We didn't want it to be by the Jews, for the Jews, about the Jews. That's it's an echo chamber, and that's fine, but you don't need to be black to go enjoy a jazz festival. That's insane. You just need to love jazz. And if you really love jazz and you really want to know the history and you really want to understand how it's made, then knowing that really just adds a layer of meaning. It doesn't detract from anything. It's not about ownership. It's not about any of that. It's really just sharing the simcha, as Danny says in the documentary. I would say, at least from my perspective, is the main target audience is non-Jews. We're just 2.4% of the American population. I want everybody to watch this. I want everybody to enjoy comics and understand what Jews brought to the table and what we contributed to world culture. And one quick thing I'll add is that these stories are not boring. They're not these, PBS long Zoom puts you to sleep kind of, he went there and signed a deal with him, and then not at all. This is some crazy bonker stuff of comic book creators fighting Nazis and the mayor getting involved, and there's like really, really fun stuff. And Tony can talk a lot more about that as the director.
Well, we are all available as talking heads in any of those long, boring documentaries if someone should be interested in having us on them.
Well, I'm going to jump in really quick on that. And so, I personally, as a director, I wanted to make this entertaining, and it's not just, I wanted everyone to be able to really enjoy this. So the pacing of it's really fast. No disrespect to, those documentary directors that do the slow push-ins, but this feels like you're watching a Marvel movie or you're reading a comic book, and I wanted that pacing, that feel, because it's a really exciting story. I'm not of the tribe, but I mean, I love the story, and I think it's an important story to tell, especially now, like what Miriam said earlier, and Roy and Danny about anti-Semitism. Just the rise of it is really insane, and I think it's really important to tell these stories. And because how can you love Captain America but not like the Jews or non-Jewish immigrants? How can you love Superman in that story but not, right? So I think it's really important for me to tell this story, and that's why. And so if you had a chance to see it, it's definitely faster than your average bear, and probably my ADHD doesn't help, but I try to make it as exciting as I could.
I'd
Oh,
I'd
go ahead.
also I'd also just add in that I completely agree it's for all audiences and it absolutely should be. Just like all great American stories are for all American audiences. But one of the other goals I think for me as a Jewish historian who focuses on the history of Jewish America, one of the things that I wanted this whole project to do is to bring this discussion of Jewish comics as a piece of the story of Jewish literature into that space. So that's one of the reasons that, the Center for Jewish History is still involved. It was involved in the documentary, is still involved as the exhibit travels. It's the Center for Jewish History is the home to one of the largest Jewish archives in the world, the second largest outside of Israel. And they collect the collections of huge Jewish literary figures, but comics are nearly absent. And so this is a way to kind of bring this as a really legitimate piece of Jewish history into that smaller kind of discussion as well as the larger discussion.
So the thing with the Jewish history within the world of comic books is that the Jewish history of comic books lives as long as comic books have existed. So we're talking about 90 years of history. So in this documentary, which is about 30 minutes long, how did you determine what to keep in the documentary and what to keep out of it? What was the goal and, let's say, through line you were trying to create?
That's a great question. You should have a podcast. Um, I think it starts before the documentary. The documentary tells the story of the exhibit. That's sort of the broad stroke. It's not just filming the exhibit. It's telling the story in full of animations and movie clips and comics and all that stuff, but it sort of follows the same structure. We created an outline. Tony and I created an outline following the work of Dr. Mora and Danny, and really sort of we started at the beginning. We, passed by the middle, and when we reached the end, we stopped. And we sort of zoom in. We start really at the creation of the medium and the very first stories. Superman, Batman, Captain America, those guys. You've heard of them. And then we kind of go through the 50s and Wortham and the 60s and the Marvel Age. And as we get to modern times, we zoom in to focus a bit more on Jewish representation and issues and how it's being recognized in the exhibit itself. And we sort of expand that. But there's a lot of triage because you can't fit all the stories, which just means there are more stories to tell, to be
And
continued.
the exhibition also covers, I mean, obviously we couldn't fit everything in a 22-minute documentary, but the exhibition covers underground comics, alternative comics like Mouse, as well as Yiddish comics from the Yiddish press of the early part of the 20th century. So I mean, there are many more movies to be made, and there's a whole world of Jewish comics, besides, above, beyond, and outside the superhero, although obviously the superheroes are the main product of comics that people know.
So how does understanding the Jewishness of comics and their history help us understand the characters better, the medium better, and ourselves better as Jews?
I can jump in. Um, I think this is just from from the perspective of a historian, right? Knowing the history just enriches the love of the product, right? I love comics. I've loved comics for 25 years, maybe more. definitely more. And I've been reading comics, into adulthood, and I think the more I learn about the creators, every time I get to meet someone at a convention and talk to them about why they're doing what they're doing, how they were inspired to do, specific things that have moved me or changed the way I think about things, that it deepens your connection to the work. So I think just for the purpose of the fans understanding the things that they love on a deeper level, um, it's important to know that history. Uh, I think that there are elements of the superhero genre being traced back to, as Roy does so beautifully in his book, um, and Danny does as well, trace back to Jewish culture and Jewish history and Jewish texts, which it doesn't highlight Jewishness as the most important driving force behind them, but it does help, I think, people to understand where this ethos comes from. Because there's so much of the Jewish story, the immigrant story, and the biblical stories that are just kind of woven in because you write what you know. And when you're creating someone who's going to save the planet and you're trying to model that person on yourself, you're going to draw from the parts of your culture that give you strength. And I think it helps both Jews and non-Jews to know what it is that Jewish creators felt gave them strength from their own history and can continue to, have positive influence.
You can almost liken it to the dare I say Talmudic complexity of a lot of the characters, a lot of the superheroes. You don't have to have read all 700 issues of Spider-Man to enjoy a Spider-Man comic, but if you have read all 700 or however many,
Which you
issues.
have, Danny. Sure.
Well, the ones that Danny wrote and or edited,
Well,
those
of
you have to
course,
read.
especially those.
Yeah.
Well, those are, the Tanakh, but the rest,
Exactly right.
but the others are
Exactly.
commentary. So, um, no, I mean it. I mean it's funny. It's an interesting parallel. No, you don't have to know the backgrounds or the Jewish origins of many of the writers, artists, publishers, but it enriches your experience. It enriches your appreciation of a diverse world, I think. So, I mean, there are parallels to, you can read an action-packed, tear-jerking, Spidey adventure, and if the creators have done their jobs, you'll come away with a complete unit of entertainment, as we used to say in the Marvel offices. But if you have read all 700 issues and all 5,000 issues of X-Men and all the other stuff, it brings an extra depth that other people don't have.
And I'll add to that, even if you don't care about all that, if you're watching this show and you're thinking, should I watch this documentary? I could not care less. Fine. But even it works on so many levels that just I'm a huge Kirby fan. I'm assuming that everybody watching this is a Kirby fan. Well, at least you have to say you're a Kirby fan, right? You realize how much of himself he put into his characters, and particularly Captain America, and how much of it he based on his own life and his own experiences. And then that in the real world, he got into fights with Nazis and got death threats, and they involved the mayor, and they wanted to hang them from lampposts in Times Square. And then he got back at them through the comics. That's really, really juicy, fun stuff. And a lot of it has never been discussed before, or at least in this depth and in this way. So it's a really interesting experience as a fan alone.
So looking back, when the creators were creating these characters, um, should they have been more overt with the Jewish aspects of the characters and their depictions, or was that maybe more of a business decision to make it more acceptable to the larger population?
So
Well,
Danny and Tony and I were just talking about this yesterday in our panel at Juice. Someone asked very close to the same question. I think he phrased it, did they do a disservice to the Jewish people by leaving the Jewishness out and making it covert? And I'll repeat my answer before I mute myself because I'll keep talking. Um, which was primarily that the Jewishness that they put in it was so positive. It was such a positive force that it created something positive for all Americans. And and of course the tone of the time, it being wartime, was to speak for America and to unify that American experience. But whether or not people understood that some of the values of like protecting the weak and of like shining this light on the world and, spreading goodness and all of these things, whether or not they knew those came from Jewish kids who got it from a Jewish background doesn't matter because it had a positive effect, right? So that light did shine out on the world, and the purpose wasn't to say, "Look, a Jew did this." The purpose was to make something great, um, and also to they were kids who were trying to make a living, but the stories definitely meant something to them, and the characters they created did.
Yeah, and I want to just add to that. Yeah, it's hard for people to imagine today. We have this idea of being proud of who you are and where you come from and what your culture brought to the table and identity politics. And, we all wear it on our sleeves. This was not the case 70, 80, 90 years ago. If you were explicitly Jewish, you were done. It was a non-starter. Nobody would publish an explicitly Jewish character in anything targeted at, maybe in the Lower East Side Yiddish theater. That's it. You'd not be able to make a living. You'd not be able to sell your comics. It had to be hidden. So you took your ethnic Kal-El and you gave him the name Clark Kent and you put him in a waspy suit and you turned him into white bread, right? Your pumpernickel became white bread and then you put him onto the public because that's what they ate. That's just how things were. That was what.
And yet, I sort of I was talking about this yesterday as well. Both Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne, they don't have blonde hair and blue eyes. They're not, they're not Mickey Mantle all-American boys. For some of us wearing Yankee hats may know that that metaphor more than others. They have, well, they have blue hair, but I think the blue hair is meant to represent, black, dark black hair. There's something ethnic about the depictions of those characters, even though, Superman, is always portrayed next to the American flag. I mean, he's the ultimate immigrant story, although people didn't really focus on that till the past 20 years or so. But he's the ultimate undocumented immigrant from beyond the stars. He shows up. It's the cross pollination of the Moses story and the immigrant story and 100 other stories. But if he's the all American character, or if Batman's the all American superhero, Captain America finally, they had a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan American superhero, but they didn't call him Aryan for obvious reasons. But I mean, so there's a lot of mixed messages, and really the last thing these comic creators thought they were doing or wanted to do was putting overtly Jewish characters or Jewish messages, but because of who they were and how they were raised and the ethical systems that they aspired to, if they didn't always practice, that became truth, justice, and the American way. And criminals are a superstitious, cowardly lot. All that, comes from some coded Jewish ethical structure. It could be argued, again, the way I refer to it, it's something you see out of the corner of your eye. If you look directly at it, you don't see it because it wasn't intended to be seen. But looking at it decades later, it's just inevitable. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman, were from a kind of very insular Jewish background in Cleveland, and Bob Kane and Bill Finger, who created Batman, a similar kind of thing, but which also means they knew that there was a world that I keep lapsing into comic book slogans, a world that hated and feared them. Like the X-Men, which is another metaphor for prejudice. And, I mean, one thing that I find inspiring is that I can't say there's a direct correlation between Jewish studies and comics or Jewish Comic Cons, but there is a Black comic book convention in New York every year now. And I would like to think that it was inspired by the Jewish Comic Con, one of the versions of it. But, it's perfectly thrilling that other people and from other backgrounds are wanting to see their metaphors, but we got here first. Well,
There's
maybe
also
not with the
FlameCon, the
maybe not with the
LGBTQ one.
Frank. Exactly.
I wanted to add two quick things to what Danny said, which is all embellishment because you can't really, Danny's the Tanakh, right? Uh, but and the Babylonian Talmud. But the one is actually Joe Shuster, the artist of Superman, the co-creator, was actually told by his Jewish editors to not draw Superman's hair too curly, to keep it wavy so it's not too ethnic. And that says a lot about how things were looked at back then. And Danny brought up Captain America, and Steve Rogers is Hitler Youth, right? He's blonde, he's blue-eyed, he's infirm, fine, but otherwise. But Steve Rogers, even though he has that name, he doesn't come from a Mayflower family. He doesn't come from the heartland, Midwest. He comes from the Lower East Side, which was the Jewish ghetto back when he was created. He comes from the ethnic slums. And yes, there were, there's the Irish bloc and there's the Italian bloc and there's the black bloc, but it was still predominant. It's like Harlem in the 80s, still predominantly known for one ethnic population back in the day, and that was Jews. And that also tells you a lot. And it's a very, to me, if nothing else, a very powerful reminder that being an immigrant is all American.
That's in the doc, Jeff. That's what he said was in the doc. So you got to watch the doc.
Yes.
I'll tell you the doc again.
Only a little bit.
Well, kind of interesting. So I've been a comic book reader for 35 years. I was pretty certain I was steeped in all the history of comic books. The documentary actually introduces a character that actually had never heard of, Senorita Rio by Lily Renee, and I couldn't imagine like how in all my years of buying comic books, reading the history of comics, watching these documentaries, did I miss that character? So, what happened?
Well, Lily Renee was, Senorita Rio was not an especially popular character. I mean,
And Lily Renee was only in the
Lily-
industry for about 10
Yeah.
years, really. Um, she was a kinder transport survivor, and she made it to England, and then her family escaped from Vienna and made it to New York, and she joined them in New York a couple years after she had escaped to England. And when she came to America, they were scraping by, and she got a job with, what was it, Fight Comics? Who owned Fight Comics?
Also,
And and she did that for what, 8 to 10 years, and then she quit the industry when she got married and had children, and it didn't come out until decades later that she even realized anyone read her comics when
Trina
Trina
Robbins is
Robbins kind of
really,
resurrected her.
That's that's part of the story of comics as a Jewish medium. People, people didn't go around bragging that they were the artist. Maybe on Superman because it was Siegel and Schuster, but in general, there's a story Stan Lee used to tell, and I'm sure it was typical of a lot of people. He'd go to a cocktail party in the suburbs in Long Island, and he'd get into a conversation with somebody, and of course it'd be, well, what do you do? And Stan would say, I'm in publishing. And they go, oh, what kind of publishing? Children's publishing. And then, the person wanted to know more. Well, what kind of children's publishing? Well, action adventure stories for children. What kind of action? Well, I write and edit comic books, and the person would walk away. It was, we look at it with a modern lens. We're like, oh, it's another in the many American art forms like jazz and the movies. Oh, there's also comics, but well, it took a long time for jazz and the movies to be accepted, and comics lagged behind. So, I think for Lily Renee, it was just something she did. Just a lot of these guys are thought of as weirdos. That like they made enough because they worked 24 hours a day cranking out pages for crappy rates. So they made enough to put a down payment with a GI Bill on a house in the suburbs. But then all the other husbands were commuting into the city to work, and these weird guys were sitting at home at their drawing boards, and I think maybe for the kids in the neighborhood, it was once they figured out who they were, it was fun, but I don't think the other grown-ups. So, I mean, so we didn't hear of Lily Renee because Lily Renee, like a lot of people in comics of that era, probably saw it as a stepping stone or even a source of shame.
I think that's absolutely true. She talked about that in her, later in life interviews. But she also talked about how hard it was to be a woman in the industry. That it was a tough place to work, that the men were crude, that she didn't understand English, and they took joy in teaching her crosswords. So even though she did enjoy parts of the industry, she enjoyed not the industry, she enjoyed the craft. She talked about how when she was in Vienna and her family was, upper middle class and they got to, she got to wear these very fashionable clothes and things, and then she became a refugee and the family lost everything. And through Rio, she was able to dress her in these beautiful clothes and she could kind of re-enter this high society because she was this nightclub performer in the comic, and there were parts of it she really loved. And she even became a cover artist, the only female cover artist um, of the time, at least for that company. And she enjoyed that part, but it was very hard to actually be in the offices and dealing with the men in the industry. So I think exiting was another escape. And the book that Trina Robbins wrote about her, Escape Artist, was really about that, like the constant kind of escape path that she had to take into the industry, out of the industry.
So I think another, like I said, I found the documentary absolutely fascinating. And one of the terms that's used in the documentary is a phrase, white passing Jew. Can I discuss the significance of that term and how does the Jewish experience exhibit help us to kind of understand the larger diversity of the Jewish experience in history and comics?
I think the white passing Jew is for Miriam to answer, right?
I think so.
Sure. So, so the whole idea of whiteness is a construct, right? And it's a very American one too. In that, in America, there was this in the early 20th century, this kind of ethnic hierarchy of immigrants. So there were white ethnic immigrants who were not seen as white, like the Irish, who are now considered as white as anyone. The Dutch were white, but the Irish were not white. Poles weren't white. Jews certainly weren't white. So there's this kind of, further discrimination that's based on this kind of idea of white ethnicities. But I think that when we do see Jews represented in the media, and this is what we discuss in the documentary, they're presented as a very specific kind of Jew, and those are the Jews who acculturated to the point of passing as white in the United States. So Ashkenazi, Eastern European origin, Yiddish speaking background, Yiddish and English and German speaking background, as opposed to Sephardi Jews who are from the Iberian Peninsula and are Spanish and Ladino speaking, or Mizrahi Jews, or Ethiopian Jews, or Asian Jews, or Black Jews, or any of these other kinds. So what I talk about in the documentary is the tendency to represent Jews as Ashkenazi exclusively. So that diversity in Jewish characters is lacking. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that as ethnic characters were introduced, and Danny can talk much more about this in the comics industry in the 60s and 70s, kind of alongside the development of ethnic studies, they were introduced largely, I argue, through Holocaust trauma. So, if you're retconning a character Jewish or introducing a character as Jewish, oh, they were a Holocaust survivor, or their mother was a Holocaust survivor, and this is how they connect to that identity. So you get it through this story of survivorship. But that automatically classifies any Jewish character as Ashkenazi if they're surviving the Holocaust. So that's kind of one of the ways in which I think through comics, those most pronounced Jewish characters are all in that white passing kind of category, which is very exclusive. Right?
Well, it comes from the way Jews are portrayed historically in movies. Um, I mean, not starting with,
Well, Joseph.
most famously with the jazz singer, which is problematic in its own ways, but um, moving through Woody Allen's movies, moving through the whole career of John Garfield. John Garfield was always, you know, John Garfield's career consisted of audiences in Brooklyn poking each other in the ribs, going, "He's Jewish, John Garfield." You know, um, it and so it became, and then even once it became, what more acceptable to be Jewish in the movies, you'd have this kind of Woody Allen stereotype, or the Mel Brooks stereotype of a, but as Miriam says, of a Ashkenazi funny Jew. We were talking about the movie Independence Day as portraying at least three, but Miriam actually pointed out a fourth. The three known varieties of Jewish men, which are the Sabra inflected super Jew played by Jeff Goldblum, the traditional
It's a
I forgot that we do visual shtick as well as witty stuff. You've got your kind of 2,000-year-old man type character played by Judd Hirsch. By the way, The Fablemans is great.
Chet Hirsch.
Yeah. You have Harvey Fierstein playing the comic relief stereotypical gay Jewish character, which is a whole problematic series of stereotypes there. But then, as Miriam pointed out, Brent Spiner is kind of another brand of super Jew. But there are all these cliches, and none of them are Sephardic Jews, none of them are Black Jews, none of them are Asian Jews. I mean, so comics follows Hollywood, mainstream comics follows Hollywood in that way.
Yeah, I mean, and we make the point in the documentary, and if you guys watching don't know, only half of Jews around the world pass for white. And we're not white, we're considered white. If you're not sure, the Nazis didn't check if you went to shul every Saturday. That wasn't the benchmark, right? It was it was if one-fourth, right. It was a race-based idea, and about half of world Jews are not white, as Miriam said. They're, every other shade of the spectrum. I right now I can sort of look white if I'm in the sun enough. I look khaki, and then it gets darker from there. But you tell people Zoe Kravitz, who he is the latest Catwoman, right? In the Batman movie, she's 100% Jewish on both sides. And when I've mentioned this in a couple of interviews, people like fried circuits. But yes, Jews come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors. So that was part of what we wanted to highlight in the documentary.
Do you think some people are confused and think of when they think of Jewishness, they think it's only a religion, not an ethnicity? Or do you think we have gone past that, that is fully understood now that it's both?
I encounter this on the daily in my scholarly work, and I can tell you there's no consensus, right, which is really problematic. But I think if you're talking about neo-Nazis and racists, then there's no question. As Roy said, the Nazis didn't care if you went to shul. They didn't even care if you were circumcised or not. What they cared about was whether you had, and I'm putting air quotes up for your podcasters, Jewish blood, right? Which is, of course, not real. I mean, the race is a social construct. Ethnicity is real. There are genetic differences. I mean, that's why things like ancestry are so interesting for people, but it's also caused a whole series of problems in combating anti-Semitism, and not just anti-Semitism, but all kinds of ethnically based hatreds, right? Where, I can tell you I took a 23andMe test and I am 99.8% Ashkenazi Jewish. And that, I mean, I can tell
You
you,
got an
I was
email,
a little
please stop.
disappointed. I mean, I got this and I was like, wow, that just, I mean, I'm
That's
not
the point
gonna say
too.
it. It points to very, very who know. Well, I'll tell you what's interesting is when the test first came back, it was 98.9. But the more people who take the test, the more broad the genome project and everything gets, and the more they find out, they're like, no, 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 they're okay. If someone, snuck in there, they did it like, whoa, generations ago, right? But it tells you, first of all, I mean, my genetic test tells you something about a very insular community, but it also tells you, it helps explain things like genetic dispositions to certain illnesses like Tay-Sachs or Mediterranean fever, all these things that Ashkenazi Jews carry. Um, but it tells you that ethnicity is, I mean, in a way, kind of certifiable, which is really problematic, right? I think that there are different kinds throughout history of Jew hatreds, which focus on different things. In the Inquisition, no problem. Convert out, accept Jesus, survive, right? And hence crypto Jews, and this is the survival of the religion. But if it's exclusively the religion that matters, then conversion is how you save yourself. But along with Nazi racial science came the elimination of that escape option, right? So I think especially now, it's important to recognize how our scientific advancements are also being used to kind of bolster these racial theories. And let's just there's some of it tied into Project 2025 too. So it's if you want some interesting reading to tie that all together, there's Heritage Foundation provides that.
On a
The
lighter note, on a
you
lighter
did?
note, when I've interviewed, I mean, I've worked with, but I've also interviewed a lot of old Jewish cartoonists. That I wrote a book um, that called "Disguised as Clark Kent: Jews, Comics, and Creation of the Superhero." And for that, and for just I do a lot of events and have done a lot of events. And thanks to modern medical science, a lot of these people survived to fairly ripe old ages. And I would say to the Jewish ones, not so much the non-Jewish ones, I would say to the Jewish ones, how do you define being Jewish? And I gave them the choice, culturally, ethnically, religiously, I guess those are the main, nationally, just any, I said, and they all immediately told me the story about their bar mitzvah, so I think even for people who were almost completely secularized and had very little Jewish religious attachment, that was the default. I found that. So your question is a good one because there are, you know, you don't think of Woody, you think of Woody Allen as sort of an exaggerated cliche of an Upper East Side Elaine's uh, hanging out, stereotypical Jewish intellectual. You don't think of Woody Allen as going to one of the many synagogues that are within walking distance of his house, and yet somehow he is the cliched Jewish stereotype. Although you may notice he always solves the problem and gets the girl in all the movies, even though he's the nebbish. That's not an accident. Um, so, and I think for non-Jews, I don't think for non-Jews who are not like academics or think about this a lot, I don't think the idea of Jews as a culture or Jews as a peoplehood or Jews as a sensibility, I don't think that computes with most people. They somehow equate even the most assimilated Jewish person as somebody. It's a religious answer, I think, for most people who are not Jews.
Hmm.
Yeah, but you look at Judaism from its own perspective, right? How the group defines itself, and you look at the Bible as sort of the foundational narrative of Judaism. And Judaism as a religion doesn't show up till halfway through, to Mount Sinai and the commandments in the Torah, right? We start with Abraham as the Hebrews. It's a people. And then it's the Israelites when the Jacob, right, becomes Israel, and his children are the Israelites, and they go to Egypt and all that kind of good stuff. And only once they're out of Egypt and they go to Mount Sinai and they get the Torah, only then do they get a religion.
Get the
And they don't
50,
even become Jews till they reach Judea. Which is it, right? That's
Commandments.
what,
Don't even get the Torah until you're talking about the commandments.
yes. Well, they get the Torah Baal Peh, but that's a whole different. We're getting complicated, people. It's
Yeah.
comic books. We're getting complicated. You know,
And
Oh,
this
comic
is
book
this is the
fans would never get
continuity
complicated
of
with
Judaism.
continuity. That's true.
Yeah.
I'd also add on too the one further kind of addendum to Danny's point about this identity and the people that he's talking to and these old Jewish men and how they identify, which is the regionalist aspect of this, which is that we're talking about New York Jews. And New York Jews, like Israeli Jews, and here I don't know where I am on your screens, but I'm pointing here at Danny and Roy as the examples of this. I'm a Midwest Jew, and I can tell you, having been to both of these places, when there are so many Jews around, the religion for a lot of people becomes tangential. So, I mean, I know a lot of Israelis whose Jewish identity is incredibly strong, and New Yorkers whose Jewish identity is incredibly strong, and who never go to shul. So, it's really, I think, part of it in being a diaspora Jew and in being one of the few Jews in my school growing up. Jeff, you look like you know what I'm talking about. I'm not sure where you grew up, but I can tell it wasn't New York.
I was one of two Jews in my high school.
Yeah.
At least
Yeah,
two
and
that
it's
were openly Jewish. Who knows? It was one that was quietly Jewish, but then only two I knew of.
And if that's the case, then the synagogue becomes a much more important touch point, right? And Hebrew school becomes this very important touch point, or other forms of connection to Jewish identity become this really important touch point. Whereas, in New York, I've almost never felt less Jewish than when I'm living in New York and everybody's Jewish. So there's something to that too. And the same I would say applies to these comic book characters too. Like, do we really need to say that Peter Parker's Jewish if everyone who's living in New York and who's reading it knows what oy vey means? When he says oy vey, they're like, oh yeah, sure. They know who he is. But the readers in New Orleans, did they know? Because they're not surrounded by that. It's not so ingrained in the culture as it is in New York.
I will say this. I knew Spider-Man was made by Stan Lee and Jewish, and I had some information about Hal Jordan, but I never thought of them as Jewish characters until I saw the document. I was like, you know what, does make sense, but I don't think I ever considered them that way.
And you're not supposed to. They weren't designed to be thought of as Jewish characters. This is a reading of subtext, that we've placed on it in recent years.
So
I mean, Hal Jordan has become Jewish canonically in the comics, but that is a new addition. Whether or not Spidey always had the kind of Stan Lee Jewish always kind of threaded in the DNA, that's the whole interesting discussion. And we don't try to superimpose it forcibly in the documentary. We try to raise it as a question and explore it. And I think Tony did a very good job at balancing that. He was really sort of the perfect devil's advocate on all of that, making sure it has that value.
So we're looking at the JewCe exhibit. How does that help people who are not Jewish understand the diversity of the Jewish experience?
We've been using the word passing a lot in this.
It's like a Brady Bunch thing. I'm going to point down. There you go.
I think the thing about an exhibit, it's like a book. You've got to have some, at least incidental interest in the topic to even open the door and go in. So, I mean, I think once you go in, if you have the germ of an interest in that, assuming you're not just trying to get in out of the rain, into this museum that's in the museum district in Washington right now, I think it's a user-friendly thing. It's not, I would guess that the average person attending would be more interested in the superhero stuff and maybe the graphic novel stuff. They're probably less interested in the Eddie Portnoy part that's about the Yiddish press. But for those who are, it's an added bonus. It's a really rich topic and part of the history. So I think, again, someone who goes to a museum and someone who's going into a Jewish museum is predisposed to have an interest in what in these interesting aspects of the history that we put on display, and then it heightens, it widens and deepens their knowledge and their appreciation of the stuff. It would be, I mean, I think that's sort of the mission of a museum in general.
Well, the documentary is sort of the gateway drug. You care about comics, you walk and you see it in some pop culture museum, you walk in to check it out, and before you know it, you're eating rugelach and kvetching with your family, and you don't know. That's how we get you.
So for our listeners, where can they find the documentary, and where can they find the exhibits coming up?
So the documentary is on JLTV, Jewish Life Television. It's a cable channel. If for some reason you don't have it already, then you just speak into your remote Jewish Life Television, it pops up. You don't have to download anything. It's just like as NBC or anything else. It finishes its run at the end of the year, and then it goes into a streaming service. It should be Freevee, I think, which is an Amazon one. TBD. But if you follow any of us on social media, and we'll share our handles in a second, we'll announce it. The exhibit, and Miriam can speak a lot more in detail about it. Right now, it's at the Capitol Jewish Museum in DC, and I think, Miriam, it's booked for like a decade.
We have a decade-long traveling schedule that is not yet full. For any relevant museums or people with local museums who are interested, they should contact the Center for Jewish History, as they are the owners of the traveling exhibit. And they can find a time in the schedule where I don't know for sure they are in discussion with, who has and has not confirmed, so I can't list all the amazing places that it will go. But I can tell you that it is already in Hong Kong, and it did just open up in DC, and it is going a lot of other places, hopefully to a museum right near you.
Soundbite.
Well, guys, I want to thank you so much for doing the show. It was an absolute honor to speak to all of you, and at least I love the documentary. Hopefully the exhibit comes around where I am at some point. But I want to thank you guys so much for doing this for me.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Do you want to share your handles, where to find you?
Sure. Okay, mine's at Tony Kim Studios.
DannyFingeroth.com.
MiriamMora.com.
Okay. RoySchwartz.com and at Real Roy Schwartz on all social media. Not the fake ones. Real Roy Schwartz.
Thank you guys so much. Have a fantastic night, everybody.
Zach.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Vertical Stars podcast. Please like and subscribe. Turn for the next episode when James Dumont boards the mothership to discuss the series American Sports Story, Aaron Hernandez, on Netflix. To the next voyage, travel on.